Everybody, welcome back to a special airport edition of Sustainable Design Masterclass. It was more of a desert rainwater edition of Sustainable Design Masterclass. I'm so stoked. I've got beside me two amazing experts of the Master of Water, Brad Lancaster, Neil Spackman from Saudi Arabia. This is so cool because water is the issue, probably one of the biggest issues of our time and our future. And you gotta want to concentrate. You want to be present for this. I'm in an airport, but I'm turned off my cell phone, turned off my distractions, and I encourage you to do the same. And yeah, this is Sustainable Design Masterclass, co-founded by me and Neil Spackman. We're dedicated to bringing you some of the really top regenerative system designers, water wizards, people who are really looking at the future and making a difference and allowing people to survive in extreme environments and thrive in extreme environments. And so without further ado, I'm going to take it over and let Neil introduce our special guest, Brad Lancaster.
All right. So thanks, Raleigh. Thanks, Brad, for being here. Thanks to those of you who are attending. I recognize a bunch of names on our attendees here. Some folks who are very experienced in this type of work. We've got Jan Bird. We've got Daniel Halsey here, and a bunch of others. So I'm excited to have this sort of group together right now. Brad, I don't know if I've ever told you this, but when I first got started in this kind of work, I went through a massive career jump where I went from a cubicle job where I was writing reports that nobody really cared about to being in the desert and all of a sudden managing a watershed and trying to bring this piece of land back to productivity. And Brad's books, which are Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond, were some of the most fundamental in helping me find my feet and figure out how to wrap my head around what we ought to be doing. And we are just on 7 years ago that I got started in this kind of work, and I've been doing it professionally ever since. Brad, you've been doing this since the mid-'90s, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you've just got, a few years on me with this, and I've wanted to have you on since we started this webinar series, but in part because the stuff you've written and the stuff you've done in Tucson as well, and I don't know everything that you're doing, obviously, but I think how we approach water, especially in places where you work and places where I work and in drylands in general, as well as in temperate landscapes anymore, because we're doing things like draining fossil water aquifers. It's so crucial. It's the most important thing. If you want land to be productive, you got to get your water right. And so today's webinar, I think, is going to be a little bit more conversational. I do want you to take the lead on it, Brad, but we're not doing a presentation as much as we're doing a conversation. So I'm happy to have all you folks here who I know we've got some hydrologists in here that I can see. We've got other people doing work, and we've got you. And I'd love to see where this goes. So with that introduction, welcome to the Sustainable Design Masterclass, Brad. We're pleased as punch to have you on here.
It's great to be here. So if you want me to take the lead, maybe I should give a little info on some of the beginnings with what happened in Tucson and where things grew from there. Does that
Let's
sound
do that.
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So, I grew up in Tucson, seeing the water situation continually get worse, and got to college, and I learned how to articulate problems, but wasn't really learning any solutions. And that didn't shift until I took a permaculture course in sustainable design, and where there was this great idea of how we could turn problems into solutions. And water was definitely a big issue here, as we killed our once perennial Santa Cruz River. Our aquifer levels have been dropping consistently for decades, and we lost our riparian forests and so on. Enough of the bad story. It's the same all over the place. Yep. So I was lucky enough after taking the permaculture course to travel to Southern Africa, visited Mr. Zephaniah Piri Maseko, who is a self-taught water farmer, and he would plant the rain, thus plant the rain, to literally grow a water plantation. So he was in an area, the driest region of Zimbabwe, but by planting rather than draining the rain that fell on his land, he was able to raise the water table, and over time he has dramatically increased the amount of vegetation, the living sponge of vegetation, the soil life. So the rate at which water now infiltrates the soil is much quicker than it was in the past. And the duration that the moisture stays in the soil is much greater than it was in the past. The last time I got to visit him a few years ago, just before he passed away, it was unreal. I mean, water was just seeping out of the soil all over the place. And when I first visited him, his swales were dry. Now, this last time I visited him, the groundwater had risen up to the basins of the swales, and he would just put a bucket in there and grab his water and then carry it wherever he wanted if he wasn't conveying it with gravity and another earthwork. But if we go back, after I spent some time with him, my first visit, I told him how impressed I was of his situation. And I asked how long it took. He said it took 30 years, to which I was shocked, because that seemed like a very long time to me back then. It doesn't anymore. But he said, but the key is you've just got to start. And I was kind of tending to run from my problems at the time. So I was asking him where I should move to, where I might have a better go of it. And he said, no, you can't leave. You've got to go back. You've got to set your roots deeper than you ever thought possible, and you've got to figure this out. Otherwise, if you run from your problems, they'll just follow you anywhere you go, and you will be planting problems everywhere you go because you never figured out how to transform that problem into a solution. So I came back determined to do that, and I have to admit, at the time when I took the permaculture class, what lured me in was water harvesting, but it wasn't as strong as I thought in that particular class. And I told my instructors that, and they said, well, then why don't you teach it? So that was a great gift that they kind of turned the problem into a solution. Here's a complaining student, and they said, well, why don't you address that? So I just jumped in full on and read everything I could, tried to visit everyone that I could that was doing this, and started experimenting like crazy. And I started in literally in my backyard. So my brother and I had just purchased a very degraded urban lot where the home was about to be condemned, and set about doing much of what the African water farmer had, but in our own context. And the results were phenomenal. We just found dying vegetation rebounded. Lots of new vegetation started to self-volunteer, and that which we planted was doing far better than what was going on with our neighbors. And when I mention neighbors, I'll segue into one of the first things we did is we organized an annual neighborhood tree planting. And this was for a number of reasons. We were reacting to the fact that our urban neighborhood had very barren, solar oven-like public rights-of-ways. So there was not much community interaction because it was so uncomfortable to be outside. So we went door-to-door knocking and introduced ourselves, and then set up these potlucks and whatnot, and where we all asked each other, what do we want as a community? And everyone wanted more life, more community, more interaction. So, and people weren't really into going to the neighborhood meetings. So we thought, all right, let's do something different. Let's organize an annual tree planting, and let's bring some life back into the public realm. But at the time, the city's tree planting program only offered exotic, ornamental, invasive species. They weren't offering any multi-use species, that produced food. They weren't offering any native plants that were the best suited for our climate, soils, and wildlife. So we made our own plant list, and with their blessing, we're able to use that, and they agreed to acquire those trees for us at a subsidized cost. And the other thing that we really wanted to push was, which was a radical 180-degree shift, was plant the rain before we plant any tree. So every tree had to go into a water harvesting basin, which is, at the time, that was the opposite of what would happen. People would typically plant on mounds. I think that was done in part so they wouldn't have to dig so much to a hard soil. They just bring in loose soil, put the mound there. The landscape industry liked that because they could sell more product, but it didn't perform well. But our planting in the basins did great, and we found we had at least a 50% greater success rate with those trees planted in basins compared to those just planted at grade. Because if people forgot to water or just ignored the new planting, it had a much better survival rate. The other thing, when we selected these, we made our own plant list, we selected, we looked to the local ethnobotanical record, and we looked at what species were used for the most uses. So we combined the best adaptation of these native species with greatest use. So food production, medicine, fiber, other craft materials, and so on. Even though we didn't know how to use all of them, okay, we just knew they could be used. And that first year we planted over 200 trees just with neighborhood volunteers. And since then, going every year, we've now planted over 1,500 trees as a neighborhood since 1996, which is fantastic. It's dramatically transformed the neighborhood. It's much cooler now. It's much more walkable, bikeable. Many species of native birds have returned that had long been disappeared from the neighborhood. The results were amazing. It didn't matter how bad my day went away from home. When I'd come home, my spirits would soar as I would see, hey, this is getting better every day. This is, I live where I want to be, and I'm creating or helping grow. I'm working with natural systems to be in a place I want even more so. That was a huge success, but it's been an ongoing process because, in my books, I have these 8 principles of water harvesting, 4 of which I got from Mr. Peary, the African water farmer.
Yep.
And all these principles, they're just reminders of, hey, did you remember to think of this? Did you remember to do this? They're just reminders, basically, to make sure we didn't forget something. They're not best management practices, which I don't like very much, because best management practices have a ceiling. It's a checklist. There's no thought in a best management practice. It's just, did I do that? Yep, I did it. Check. Move on. Don't evolve. Okay. Whereas my intention, at least with the principles, is they're a reminder. So one of those is you want to maximize your living and organic ground cover, basically the living sponge. That's it's a reaction to seeing so many plantings where it's just bare earth, single tree, very little biodiversity, and anytime there's leaf drop, fruit drop, or prunings made, everything is shipped away. It's exported, and it's turned into a waste as opposed to left as a resource. So that idea of maximize the living and organic ground cover, if people use that principle and the other principles as a checklist, they're using them wrong. and they're not going to get the results they could. So yeah, I can see I have mulch in the basin. I could just say check and done. But if I do that, I'm not going to evolve. And one thing we realized in the initial plantings is our basins were too small, okay? And they weren't of large enough capacity to handle the leaf drop and any prunings that were done on the tree as they grew. You know, we cut up the prunings, try and put them back under the tree. These prunings created a mound, okay, because we had made such a shallow basin initially. So we realized, oh, we need to create a bigger water catchment basin to catch the rainwater, to capture the leaf drop, to capture the prunings that we cut up and put within them. And then we also realized, well, we're missing the boat. We're capturing direct rainfall, but not the water flowing down the street. And we realized our basins were too high. We needed to make them lower than the street so we could direct the water from the street to the street's basins with gravity, no pumps or anything. So the learning continues that way. You know, and one of the other principles is the first one is start with long and thoughtful observation, and we finish with that principle. That's the 8th one, but I call it the feedback loop instead. It's just long and thoughtful observation again after you've started doing things and see, did you reach the highest potential or could you go further still? So this was all part of that. And for these we've been planting these trees for 22 years and planting the rain for 22 years, and we're still learning. We're still evolving. So now, it used to be when we started these plantings, the main thing is we just wanted trees in the ground. So whether people did the water harvesting basin or not, they'd still get a tree. Now we're like, nope, you don't get a tree until you've made the water harvesting basin. Or, you know, we've worked with you to make it, or you've, hired a neighborhood service to do that. And those basins have to meet a higher standard than most commercial landscapers use, and a higher standard than the city uses. So it's got to be lower than the street, and it has to have a minimum capacity, and it also has to be, the top of the mulch layer has to be at least 3 inches lower than where the curb core, the hole in the curb, comes into the basin, because you want to have this waterfall effect. Why is that? Here, I feel I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Okay, I'll just explain this real quick. All right. So this is in the appendix of my first book, the second edition. But think of a triangle, and and there's 3 points to that triangle, and you have speed, depth, and volume at each of those. So this applies for flowing water. Anytime you reduce the speed, the depth, or the volume of flowing water, you reduce its ability to carry things like sediment, and it will drop sediment out of the flow. But anytime you increase the speed, depth, or volume of flowing water, you increase its ability to carry things. So I have a principle of water harvesting that slow, spread, and sink the flow of water. That was meant as a reaction to seeing how in most of the built environment we pave, pipe, and pollute the water. We pave the watershed, we concentrate the water to a smaller drainage, and we shoot it out at a higher speed. So slow spread, sink, that works a lot of the time, but not all of the time. Sometimes we got to use the opposite side of the erosion triangle. So we noticed every time that we would, you'd have your street curb. Let's see if I can do this. Use my hand here. Let's say my hand is the street curb, and then we've got the street here. So we would make a hole right there, or we'd cut the curb right there, so the water flowing along the street gutter could enter the curb cut or curb core and get to the basin that's on the other side of this, and where we have the tree growing to shade over the street and all. Okay, a mistake we very often made and a mistake that, oh man, I see all the time, is that the curb cut will be level with the street gutter, and oftentimes the street side basin is that same elevation or barely deeper. So the water flowing along the street curb, the slope actually gets even less when it goes into the curb cut or curb core. And so all the detritus that is being, leaf drop that's being carried in the water drops out and creates a detritus berm that blocks the curb cut and no water comes in. So we create a curb core or curb cut, and then I purposely make at least a 2 or a 3-inch waterfall drop immediately on the other side of the curb. So if now looking sideways, if this is the curb, okay, and then if the curb is here, so say my fist is the curb, here's the street, and then we make our basin here, street side. When I make the hole here in the curb, I have at least a 2 or 3-inch drop just on the inside of the curb. So any water flowing through, now it's going to speed up at that little waterfall point, and it's going to pull a lot of that organic matter and detritus into the basin, where it's a resource. It's free mulch, okay? If it's litter, if it's garbage, no problem. It's easier to pick it up because it's all concentrated in the basin. You can pick that up later. So these street side basins, they're pulling water off the street to irrigate street side trees for free. That's great. And that effort in the big picture is slowing, spreading, sinking the flow of water. It's basically taking the water, it's flowing down the street, and it's letting it into the street side landscaped areas, which then act as the floodplain or of the street, because the street's a waterway and big storms here. But we reconnect the floodplain to the channel, the paved channel, and so water is able to infiltrate. We're able to increase our available rainfall by 3, 4, 5 times because we've got all that runoff from the street adding to the rainfall on the tree already. So what is it? In Jeddah, they get, I can't remember, is it 2 inches of rain a year? So you can easily increase that to 6 or more.
Yeah, it's about 70 millimeters.
Okay. Yeah. So getting a little bit closer to 3 inches there. So you can easily increase that to 9, 12 inches of rain a year if you direct street runoff to street side trees, if you can get the water to them. That's what we found here. So we're able to grow vegetation along our streets at a greater density and diversity than you would find in our healthy, lush parts of our desert. Tying into that, growing these native food plants, we have played with the fact that there's over 400 native food-bearing plants in the Sonoran Desert. So we've taken the most reliable, delicious, and easy to succeed with ones and planted them along these streets. And we find we've got much greater food production, medicine production and all, because there's much more water along these streets. So we can transform our streets into corridors of water, people, wildlife, food, medicine, and so on, and shade, where before they were solar ovens. And we're only using what is right there, free and on site. We're using the rain that's falling from the sky, the runoff from the street. We did initially bring in the trees, but now we're starting to plant in situ from the seed of the trees growing along our streets. We select for the best characteristics, best food quality, flavor, densest pod clusters for more efficient harvest, best ripening time. And then we plant those seeds in water harvesting basins. We make the earthwork, plant the seed, plant with the rains, and then we don't have to water, ever. You can water, you can supplement, but we'll find those seedlings will germinate with the rains, they'll take off. The roots have never been bound in a pot, so they grow much more extensive root networks. And it doesn't cost us anything except the time of collecting the seed, scarifying it, planting it. Yeah, these are some of the ways we've gone. We have since I was thinking I was next going to talk about how we've started to utilize the foods and other products of these street-side plants. But before I do, I just want to check in. I've just been going and going. I don't know if you want to ask any questions or anything before I launch into that, or if you want to take me in a different direction. Yeah.
So we've got a number of questions on here. One thing I do want you to talk about is the social aspect of this, because going door to door, there's a bit of an echo, hey? Is anyone else hearing an echo?
Yeah, I hear the echo.
All right. We'll just keep going. I live on a park, and I've thought of going door to door and being like, hey, let's turn this park into something, but it's like the social aspect of that is daunting for a lot of people. And so rather than talk about the how-to, because I know that there's tons of extensive stuff on, how to do a Berman Basin. Like, I think you've got at least 3 PDFs online for free on all sorts of stuff related to that. I'm interested in the social aspect of what you've done because there's less guidance on that, in part because culture plays such an enormous role in it. But I know that initially when you were doing curb cuts, that wasn't legal, was it?
No.
Right. You just started doing this, and you had the neighborhood behind you because you had a few years of working together and doing this stuff, and people were seeing the results.
Yeah.
But what happened in that interplay between the neighborhood level and the city level? That's a story that I want to hear, because in my travels and in my work, I frequently come across people who are like, oh, I want to do this thing, I want to do X, which is beneficial to the environment and more profitable and less costly and has fewer negative externalities and, right? But there's some policy that prevents them from doing it. Or there's a municipality, there's some sort of power structure that uses the legality of something to prevent us from implementing a solution. And so I'm interested in that interplay that happened. What happened the first time someone from the city showed up and they were like, you can't cut this. This is vandalism, right? Something like that has to have happened, and that's what I want to hear about, Brad. Before we get to we are going to do people's questions because we've got some that are quite technical already about sizing berms and about all sorts of stuff, but we'll get to that. I want to hear you talk about the social stuff because that's the trickier stuff.
Okay.
Once you learn the climate and the environment and the tools, it's fairly straightforward to put in a good design. But the people stuff is tricky.
Great. Okay. Well, let me just start by saying we were already experimenting on our own property in our own yard when we organized the tree planting, and so people were seeing how our once degraded property was starting to be transformed. So when we decided we wanted to do the tree planting, I wrote an article for the neighborhood newsletter. I put up flyers, and then I literally did start going door to door. And at the time, I had just become the neighborhood association president. So it was a great opportunity to introduce myself and try and invite people to get involved in the neighborhood again in whatever way they wanted to, and then say, hey, we've got this tree planting going on, would you be interested? And it was an amazing time to just converse with people, as I realized it's surprisingly difficult to get people to plant a tree sometimes, because they don't know what tree to plant. They have never planted a tree before. They're intimidated by it. They think it's going to be more work for them. And we'd hear strange things like they said, oh, if we plant a tree, the homeless people will hang out under it. To which I would say things like, well, wouldn't you like a tree you could hang out under? And why not create the world you want to live in? So we got some people initially involved, but a lot of people said no initially. But that wasn't a problem because we've had 22 years to work on them, and most of them have turned around. But this got me to know a lot of my neighbors, way more than I ever would have before. And I really felt part of the community at that time. And I heard all these great stories about the neighborhood history and all. So it was amazing for me. But because so many people got to know me, I had more backing, especially after the tree planting was so successful. And we did not do curb cuts that first year. We didn't do curb coring until 10 years after we started the tree planting. So we had, not that it has to be that long, we just didn't clue into that potential until 10 years later. But people saw how great the trees were. The city saw how great the trees were. They were really into it because our neighborhood had been a real problem neighborhood with crime and all, and the crime was dropping with the tree planting. So having a positive example that people could see really helped, I guess, open doors so people would listen to us. And then when it came to do that first curb cut, it was after a real big storm, and we just realized this is crazy. We can't let this water keep going by. And we had already been pulling water off the street because anywhere there was a dip in the curb where there was a driveway, we were already directing water in through those points to basins on either side of the driveway dip. And they were working great. So we'd already proved the concept where we went the extra step and took the illegal step of cutting the street curb for the purpose of collecting water. You could always legally cut the curb to let in automobiles, but not water, not prior to that. So we had already been using the automobile inlet as the water inlet. Now we wanted to do it just for water. So because we'd already done these small-scale trials with the existing infrastructure, and we knew it worked, we're like, yes, let's do it. So we did it on a Sunday when no one from the city was watching, and it worked great. We made a few minor mistakes, but that's why we just started with one. Like one of my principles, start small. Okay, awesome. You're pulling up an image. Perfect. So there's right there is one of the can everyone see this that I'm seeing on my screen too?
Yeah, everyone can see it.
Awesome. Okay, so you see my nephew there playing in the street runoff, and we've got the street side basin next to the inlet there. And so that was 100% legal. Okay, no problem. And we proved the concept there. The neighbors would go by and they'd see, man, your vegetation is growing twice, 3 times as fast as ours. It's much healthier. What's going on? I said, well, we're increasing the amount of rainfall that's available to it. And unlike using city water or well water, which contains a lot of salts, which are harmful to the plants and the soil life in our arid environment, rainwater has no salt, so it was leaching the salts out of the root zone too. So then we're like, okay, let's cut the curb, and we didn't tell the city for, let's see, I guess 3 years. Was it 3 years? No, maybe it was 2 years. Instead, we were just kind of working out the kinks on our end, and we were, to be honest, we were a little afraid that the city was going to crack down on us. But I wanted the vegetation to get us better established around the curb cut to really prove the model. And neighbors were getting really excited. They're like, oh, I want to do this. It's just your stuff's getting better and better. And they didn't have a driveway dip, some of them. So then I finally approached the city, and there was a lot of resistance, but because I had so many neighbors calling into the city saying they wanted to get a permit, they wanted to do this, and I was calling them too, saying, look, I got all these people that want to do it. We got to legalize this process so it's not done illegally. We were able to have these meetings. And another key thing is in these meetings, right when the meeting started, all the engineers had their heckles up and everything. They were not happy to be there, and I felt like they wanted to shut me down. So I just started asking questions. I said, well, what are the issues you have along your streets? And they said, well, we've got way too many potholes. We've got flooding. The temperatures just keep going up and up, which is shortening the life of the asphalt. We're finding more and more crime. There's a lot of litter. All these different things. And it's like, that's great. It's not great you have those problems, but we're trying to address all of that. And these curb cuts, I see them as an integral part of addressing all those problems, and not just addressing those, but actually meeting even more potentials. So I flipped the conversation to not me demanding this thing be done, that they change the rules just because I wanted it, but to say, all right, look, I'm looking at the same stuff you have. These same problems you have are problems we have in the neighborhood. And by pulling the water off the street to street-side tree basins, we're reducing the flooding. By growing the trees that shade over the street, we're cooling the street and lengthening the life of the asphalt. By also shading the walkways, we're getting more people to walk and bicycle. More neighbors are getting to know one another, and so crime is dropping. We're also getting a healthier populace in that neighborhood because people are exercising more. People started to care more, so they started to pick up litter. I'll go back to that one you were just showing before with the kids picking the prickly pear fruit. Oh, if you can. I don't know where it went. Well, if it comes back, there we go. So we had grown so many food plants that we had families out there picking from the harvest. And that really drops crime. And it also calms traffic speeds because you've got these kids out there. And then they're just so happy and all. People want to jump in and do likewise. So the city became open. And then I went to not the transportation department, but I went to the flood control department and whatnot, and they saw the value of this. In fact, we had one of the flood control, the head of the flood control for the city, he was one of our greatest advocates. And the engineers were saying, look, these curb cuts are going to undermine our roads because the water is going to get under the asphalt and destroy the road. And Frank Souza, with the flood control department, he pulled up all these examples of unintended curb cuts all around town where there was no damage to the road. And that was amazing that he had done that. So that shut that argument down to a large degree. Other departments that had been looking for heat island abatement and flood control, they jumped in and put in their support. So I think the key thing is we need to try and think of the others we're meeting with and working with and what are their issues and how can we help address their stuff as opposed to just pushing our own agenda. Of course, I was pushing the curb cuts, but in this larger context. So it took 3 years, but we got it legalized. Now, why did it take 3 years? Well, I wasn't pushing it as hard as I could have. But at the same time, something that was interesting is a colleague, Ann Audrey, was working from within the city to create a water harvesting guidance manual. And that was great because it was a means of educating folks within the city. But it sat on her department head's desk for over a year. It may have been 2 years because they weren't into releasing this. They weren't into this new way. But as we went on with our plantings as I taught countless workshops, he had countless presentations, and as my rainwater harvesting books were released that were promoting all this stuff, the populace of Tucson was getting more and more educated and aware of this. They were touring and seeing what we were doing, getting excited, and so we got more and more people calling mayor and council. So we're building the political will, okay, to the point that Ann's supervisor was directed to release the water harvesting guidance manual. So that, coupled with my books, is really getting the knowledge base out there. And then a city council member, well, he wasn't yet. He was running for city council, Rodney Glassman. His aide, his campaign chairperson and aide, Katie Bolger, she brought him to my house because she knew he was interested in water issues. So I showed him everything we were doing in the house, everything we were doing in the neighborhood, and he was really excited. He said, "Man, this is so simple." I said, "Yeah, it's very simple." We talked and strategized of what could happen and what he could put on his platform. So he decided to create a water harvesting, rainwater harvesting ordinance and a gray water harvesting ordinance. And those were mixed successes at first, but basically what happened is it resulted in all commercial landscapes need to harvest at minimum enough water to provide 50% of their landscape's irrigation needs. And working with Ann Audrey on that and others, we did calculations to show that a typical commercial development could do so without any tanks. They could just do it with passive earthworks. So we did that before releasing, finalizing the ordinance, so that we wouldn't have the development industry freaking out on costs. We can say, well, there's no material cost in this. It's just simple earthworks. It's just grading. That's it. And you're going to be reducing your flooding anyway, which you have to address anyway. So this all ties in. So that was a big success. And here, this photo that you guys are seeing, this is our public right-of-way in front of our house after we did things 10 years after. Before that, it was just a sterile strip of nothing, just bare earth. But that's such a wonderful thing to walk through. And so as we got more of the public walking through this and seeing for themselves, more and more people wanted it. So we've since had more successes in that now not only is rainwater harvesting with these curb cuts and all legal, whereas before it was illegal, and not only is it now mandated in new commercial developments, but it's also rebated. So then we worked with mayor and council to create some rebates. So you can get $2,000 rebate for a rainwater harvesting system. It can be passive strategies, which are like rain gardens and earthworks, or active, which would be tanks with valves. And you can get a $1,000 gray water harvesting rebate. And things have gone even further still, is we now have gotten to the point where these curb cuts are mandated in all new city road construction or major retrofits, because it's been realized the myriad benefits of this strategy. Gary Whitwer, he's the landscape architect with the City of Tucson Transportation Department. It was just interesting talking with him, as he's really taking off with all this stuff and putting in a lot of great systems around town. But he's very often at odds with the engineers, especially since the engineers that buy into it and see the benefits, they move on, a new bunch comes in, and we have to start all over again. But thankfully, Gary's been consistent. But he has found that there's many benefits. Not only is there reduced water needs, you don't have to have an irrigation system, with plastic pipe and all. There's no leaks with these passive water harvesting systems. But all those would be obvious. But the one that that really surprised me, he said it's the best benefit, is there's much less weeding. Because the perennial plants, native perennial plants that we plant, they're so much better adapted than the weeds to capture this passively harvested water that we really bank deep in the soil, that the city's weeding needs are much reduced in street-side water harvesting basins compared to a typical drip irrigation system. And the image right here is we succeeded so much alongside the street. Now we've been succeeding with strategies within the street. So our neighborhood got a community development, a neighborhood reinvestment grant for $500,000. And the neighborhood gets to tell how to spend the money. So we decided to spend it 4 ways: on tree planting, water harvesting, traffic calming, and public art. All are in this photo. So we were awarded in 2009, and by 2012 it had been built out. So what you're seeing here in the foreground is a chicane or a pullout. It's where there used to be on-street, actually there's no on-street parking there because it was right in front of the stop sign. So we didn't lose any parking. But that is put where people would typically parallel park on the street curb, and created this 2 to 3 foot deep basin, put in some rock, a lot of vegetation, and then we got a big rainfall. This is right after it was put in. So the plants are very small still, haven't fully gotten established. But all that water that's sitting there, a couple thousand gallons easy, would have just gone down the storm drain. But now it's going to infiltrate in and irrigate that vegetation for free. So it's calming traffic. You can see it's making a more bikeable community. It's controlling flooding. It's growing more canopy. And then a little bit in the background there, in the traffic circle, you see a crossroads sign. We incorporated public art, too, some of which tells the story of water. Not that one in particular. But when we get the neighbors to plant much of this, so the neighbors planted the vegetation within the traffic circle. And we got a different neighbor to create each sign on the crossroad sign. So we're always trying to see how can we get people to literally invest their time, energy, and set roots, so that we have more people looking out for this stuff, caring for it. So by doing this, all these efforts with that grant in the neighborhood, we now harvest. With the strategies we implemented with that grant, we harvest about 1 million gallons of runoff per year. Which before would just flow right out of the system. And that's just the beginning. We got to do so much more. It's just a start. But yet it has really inspired other neighborhoods in town to do likewise and to apply for similar grants and whatnot. So. We're always striving, to create new ways of doing things, then evolve them. And I can go into many details of how we've since improved these designs since we first put them in. But the key is, I mentioned earlier that I got to travel and visit this water farmer. You've been working in Saudi Arabia. I wrote these books, and where did it all come from? Well, the bulk of it came from just getting in the dirt and doing it and learning from what works and what doesn't, and not walking away when something doesn't work, but to just dive in deeper and go, okay, what about this didn't work? How did the water flow, and how could it have better flowed? What's going on with the sediment? And then ever improving it. And I use that principle set to work through that, to ever improve it. And I got to use that principle set and others, not just for how the water flows and sediment flows, but people flow too. Mm-hmm. So some of the feedback mechanism with people is from these early plantings, before we started the plantings of water in the plants, in these public right-of-ways, the biggest barrier to walking in the neighborhood was people parking in the walkways. Because no one felt safe parking on the street. So they try and park their car as close as possible to the house, because we had a lot of break-ins, we have hit and runs. So after transforming the public right-of-way, now people feel safe parking on the street, because there's more neighbors looking out and walking along the street. So like, oh, it's cool. And they'd rather park under a shade tree. It's on the street, and now you got all these water harvesting basins along the paths, so they can't park in the public right-of-way anymore. It's a 5-foot wide pedestrian path, but then it's trees and basins on the other side. So we've shunted the cars out. But we found that some people are now taking over the right-of-way with vegetation to the point that no one can walk along the footpath. They're forced into the street because people won't prune their plants or whatnot. So we're like, all right, well, how do we address that? And the other thing we're having to address is the city, if they see a traffic circle or a chicane or a street side basin that's real weedy or just not looking good, they'll come in and herbicide everything. And, the trees, all of it, and or they'll cut it down. So photos you guys are seeing now, we're creating this neighborhood foresters effort, because we just realized the city hired crews, they don't care. So we have worked with the city, we're working with mayor and council, and we're telling them, do not come to our neighborhood unless you want to come to one of our free trainings. So we're trying to train up the people that live in the neighborhood, and we're willing to train any city hired crews as well on the proper way of pruning, okay, the proper way of caring for the understory plantings, and how we can plant more. So when we get any bare spots, we can bring that back. And we have these 4 levels of foresters, and I can send a link later of those to y'all, where we're trying to incentivize people to get involved. So if you help us, we'll help you. So if you help us plant trees for others, we'll help you plant trees and other understory plantings. We'll give you training on the care. And we kind of have this merit badge incentivization. We've got these neighborhood foresters badges. And if you get to a certain level of commitment and competency, that you've taken a certain number of trainings, you're now caring for the public right-of-way in front of where you live to a certain standard, you become a forester. And you get access to free tools. You get the shirt or the hat. You get public recognition. And then if you go up to the next level, that you actually take care of, work with neighbors together to take care of your block, you're given even more resources and help and whatnot. And it just keeps going up until, and you got to also learn more of the native food plants. You have to be able to identify what's a weed, what's a value, what's an invasive, what do you want to keep, and you have to know how to eat and have tried a certain number of wild plant foods that are grown in the neighborhood, so you can teach others what they can eat, what they can't, how you process it. And then the highest level is you take this to other neighborhoods. So we're striving for it to be not this really low bar maintenance thing where all you're doing is just taking care of what is, but we're ever striving to plant more of the forest, grow it, diversify it, increase our uses of it, so that we're generating a healthier forest. We're regenerating the forest and foresters that can take care of it and go on into the future, and we're ever increasing the potential of it. So yeah, and how do we do that? Well, again, oh man, it can be a lot of work. So I'm again going door to door as our other foresters and saying, hey, do you want to be a forester? Do you want to prune this area so people can walk through it again? Maybe it would be easier elsewhere. It'd probably be easier in more rural areas, But in the urban environment, this is not most people's priority.
Yeah.
It's they got to get to work. They got to get their kids to practice or whatnot. So we're striving with this foresters program to make a fun, easy, social environment in which they feel uplifted by being a part of the community, being with the community. We're showing them how to harvest from it. They harvest the fruits, like you saw those kids harvesting the cactus fruits, and they're not getting their trees killed by city crews because stuff's better taken care of now. And as more people walk through the cared for forest, the stewarded forest, more people want it. And so then on the other side of things, trying to work with other tree planting programs to move beyond just the quick, easy, ornamental, but let's see how can we get these multi-use plantings in place. How can we really look at this as a forest? And a neighbor of mine, he said, I think there's more desert ironwood trees in our neighborhood than there are in the Ironwood National Monument outside of town. And he said, why don't we become a satellite of the National Monument? It's like, brilliant idea. The ironwood tree, it's a legume. It has peanut-flavored seeds, which you can eat when they're mature, or when they're green, you can process and eat them like edamame. We're along those food side of things. We created this nonprofit called Desert Harvesters. And next month, we're coming out with a cookbook called Eat Mesquite and More, a cookbook for Sonoran Desert foods and living. And every region, every area can create such cookbooks if they don't have them already. But the whole idea was to show people how we can use this rich abundance that we're growing in our native wild or our native edible food forest along our streets, how people process it all. And it's great. It's this amazing culinary fusion where we have people coming from all these different ethnic backgrounds, because most of the people in my neighborhood, they're not from here. They've moved here from elsewhere. So we've got, Russian borscht, but instead of making it with beets, we're making it with prickly pear fruit. We've got Indian naan bread, but using mesquite flour. We've got mesquite chutneys. We have people making beers with the ironwood seeds, the mesquite flour. We have people using Palo Verde green beans within rice and pasta dishes and bean dishes. Yeah, it's great, and we're working with restaurants and whatnot to make more of this, to bring more of this into the daily experience of people. What you just saw, the photos there, was before the neighborhood foresters. People had to bend over and whatnot to walk through the neighborhood path. Now, once work's done, they can walk through, no problems. We're getting more people to walk. But working with the these neighborhood or citywide restaurants and all. See, we used to have these mesquite pancake breakfasts at our mesquite millings. Sorry, I'm kind of jumping around, but we wanted people to utilize all these foods being grown along the street in these street-side forests, because we had, remember I said we had looked through the ethnobotanical record to see what native species would do well, and we planted them. But we planted them when we started planting in 1996. A lot of the plants we didn't have direct experience with eating, so we since have learned that. As we've grown our community, learned from autumn elders, herbalists, and whatnot, and other wild foods, plant freaks, we got a hammer mill which grinds. And if you want to go to desertharvesters.org, there's some photo on that too. But yeah, here's a bunch of photos of some of the mesquite pods. It's like a native carob tree. They're naturally sweet pods. They're full of all kinds of great nutrients. However, every tree tastes different, so you got to taste before you pick. And so if you get a good tasting tree, keep picking. And we have these mesquite millings, these annual events where people can grind up the pods they pick into edible flour. And that flour sells from $14 to $22 a pound because there's no gluten. It's great for people with hypoglycemia and diabetes. This is the case with most of the native foods here. They slow the body's intake of sugars. So they're medicine food too, not just delicious. So you can sell the flour. You grind up 5 gallons of whole pods into 1 gallon of flour. That resulting 1 gallon of flour you can sell for $70 or just eat for free. And there's the chaff. You can make beer out of the chaff. You can soak that chaff in water, make all kinds of amazing drinks or syrups. So even the waste product is a usable product. At these millings, we would have mesquite pancake breakfast with prickly pear syrups. People could taste how good the food was. They could do likewise. We don't do the pancakes anymore. That was the gateway. Okay, but now there's so much more greater diversity. We have these insane bake sales where people are bringing just all kinds of crazy stuff made with the mesquite. And we're having other food events where we're bringing in other wild foods. So our new cookbook, Eat Mesquite and More, well, mesquite was the gateway food. That was the bait. But now we've got recipes of 20 other wild foods to lure people into what's possible there. Now here's a table of contents of that cookbook. So, thinking in the bigger picture of how do we change the bigger system, well, this cookbook is an attempt to really increase people's awareness of what's possible, the potential of what is already here in these wild food plants. How can we interact with them more? How can we plant them where we live, work, and play? Because the recipes in this cookbook are not just for how you process and eat these foods, but how you plant them, how you scarify the seeds of certain plants, how you plant the rain and then plant those seeds. That's why it's a cookbook for not just foods, but also living. And so we're hoping this elevates the platform from which we can speak to policymakers, to the public, and really shift the culture of how plantings, landscaping, and forestry is done in our area. So, I'm
going to interrupt you, Brad.
Yeah, please do it anytime, because I can just keep going.
For a minute. Yeah, I understand, because I'm going to sum up just a little bit back on the social side of things, because you hit on. Is it your microphone, Brad, that I'm echoing off of?
Yeah, it's his microphone.
Oh, I can turn it off while you talk.
Let's do that. I don't know, are you muted now, or are you just on a different mic?
Yeah.
Okay. One is that you had early adopters who were championing for you and who were local, and then you had solutions to problems that people were looking for, and then you had someone with a certain amount of gravitas and political capital in it was the flood. I don't remember what position the person had, but someone in the flood, someone who worked in the government who was over managing the floods, and he came in and backed you up on a lot of stuff, which gives you a certain amount of credibility. And that all of that fits in with things that I've seen in my work, where you need those things if you're going to have changes made. You need to have early adopters. You need to have champions who have that kind of capital. And if you don't have that, then you're still just in the very first step of trying to get established. And so it's interesting to me that you brought all those up independently, because it fits into what I've seen in other contexts. And then, of course, you can, this has ballooned and spread into so many different aspects, right? It's not just water harvesting. It's not just the interaction with the legality of it. It's not just planting trees and shading streets. It's not just, it's an entire ecosystem of different activities that fit together within your environmental context. And I think that's really, it's inspiring, first of all, because I think a lot of people see this as a model to follow, and it's not necessarily going to be mesquite and prickly pear, right? It's going to be whatever works with wherever you are. But the process you have gone through is going to be a very similar process, right? Because we're all people and we live in cities and we have neighbors, and that is the key thing, I think, for me, because all the beautiful ways that this is expanding and increasing in magnitude and in the number of people that adopt it, I think that is a natural result of the process you have gone through, because people recognize that you're solving a lot of different problems and improving quality of life with a series of quite simple techniques, but getting the people to participate, right? Getting people to buy in. Having people, come and harvest the mesquite and mill it, and you've got all your neighbors experimenting with their recipes. It's beautiful stuff. It's really beautiful, and it's something that I hope other people can take as a process. And if you're in Portland, or if you're in South Africa, or if you're in Minnesota, wherever it is, the process of how you have interacted with your neighbors and interacted with your officials is something that needs to be emulated, aside from the environmental techniques and the foods that you've taken on. And so I applaud you, and I'm really thankful to have you on. And I think we should get to questions now, because we've got 110 people who are bombarding us with stuff they want to ask you. All right,
Yeah,
so
sounds good.
Thank you very much for sharing that. It's fantastic stuff, really fantastic stuff. And I also want to say thanks to Carl. Carl DePolt has been flashing links at us that are relevant every minute or so. So thanks, Carl, for putting all that stuff out. Folks, if you're following those links, he's put about 50 on there that are going to take you in all sorts of different directions, depending on what you want to follow. But let's get to questions. I don't know if you can see in your control panel, Brad, but if you click on the questions triangle, it'll drop down a bunch, and you can see the comments people have had. One that I saw repeated a couple times is, what do you do about pollutants and toxic aspects of the cityscape that are running off into your basins?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We had Mitch Powell, Zuckerman, a researcher at the University of Arizona, do a bunch of soil samples, and he was mainly looking at heavy metals and lead and so on. But what he found in his research is there is no uptake of heavy metals into the woody perennials species from which we're harvesting, not into any of the edible parts. So that's what we're promoting in terms of the harvest. Annuals, like greens, tuber crops, corn, we don't plant any of that in the public right-of-way where they get street runoff, because studies have shown they do uptake heavy metals into the edible portion of the plant tissue. So it's right plant and right place. And then for growing the corn and the tubers and all that, we do that on private property where we're getting cleaner roof runoff. So there's no road runoff toxins in that context. So again, right plant and right place. And then another interesting thing that Mitch found in the research he was doing, it's so important that we collaborate with living systems as opposed to creating ever more non-living systems. So these street-side basins, we we're excavating much deeper, wider basins than we did initially. And when I really want a lot of capacity, I will I'll dig another 2 feet, half meter or so deeper than the bottom of the typical basin, and I'll pack it full of coarse mulch, and it's what I call a vertical mulch, so a lot of high carbon material, and that sponge of carbon matter, the sponge, along with the mulch, whether it's a vertical mulch or just a surface mulch, along with the roots of the vegetation, Mitch found that when you compare a street-side water harvesting basin, like that one in the photo right now, or it was just there, that had all the vegetation in it and the mulch, when you compare that one to a street-side basin that just has rock, or gravel, this one that you see now with all the life, it has 10 times the bioremediation ability of a rock mulched basin, because the organic matter is such amazing habitat for the beneficial soil microorganisms that help bioremediate or filter a lot of those toxins. So we're finding we are creating superior stormwater quality systems than the city was doing prior to these efforts. The city would basically create the barren detention or tension basins that would just slow the release of water, but they would do very little for stormwater quality. Whereas these living basins we're creating, they're reducing flooding, but they're also literally transforming and filtering a lot of the toxins at the same time. So great little parallel there.
I suspect a lot of that bioremediation is from an increase in the fungal network.
Yeah, so we see the mycorrhizal fungal activity just dramatically increasing. And I can't point to Mitch's research, but when you look at the book Teeming with Microbes, they claim that you can increase the surface area of plant roots by hundreds of times when those plant roots fuse with the hair-like roots of the mycorrhizal fungi.
Yep.
So by getting this life in the soil that can fuse with the roots of those photosynthesizing plants, we dramatically increase the availability of the water we harvested. So if we just created these basins and harvested tons of water, we wouldn't come anywhere close to the potential and the capacity of the system if we didn't expand the surface area of the plant's roots with this beneficial soil life. And I'm just seeing too, I can't remember the name of who's pulling up the images on my website.
It's
but
Raleigh.
Raleigh, can he hear me all right? If I can direct him to certain.
Absolutely.
Oh,
Absolutely.
you're right there now. Okay, now I see you. So I'll try and clue you into some certain galleries when I think they relate particularly well. As the more questions continue.
Question. This is more on the professional and corporate side of things from George Debs. He says, I'm a landscape architect. I've worked with companies on multiple continents. And he's interested in integrating permaculture and regenerative design into his work. But he says, I find a lot of resistance in the fast-paced / budget-oriented world of landscape architecture and design firms. Basically, many of these clients who are doing multi-million-dollar developments are not interested in putting ecology at the center of their scope and brief. What do you recommend for a newcomer such as myself who has the enthusiasm to create these systems but isn't allowed to insert these into the projects he's working on?
Yeah, I think you've got to get creative on finding what is the most strategic node or acupuncture point into which you can tap. So where I've been successful working with certain developments, let me see. I'm trying to think of an image for Raleigh here. If we look at the water harvesting image gallery, click on that one, and then assortment of water harvesting images, click on that one. Yeah, okay. So right after the black and white photos, you see a color one of a muddy basin, and then the next one. So this was taken at a co-housing development, the Milagro co-housing. So the first photo of just the muddy water, that's the before photo of what the common landscape looked like after we made our basins, but there's no vegetation, no mulch yet. We haven't gotten there yet. But we had 2 inches of rain fall in about an hour, and you can see all the water we caught that would have been lost. And then the next photo will show you what it looked like after we put in the mulch and the vegetation, the living pumps. And stuff just took off. And now if you go back today, you can't even see through there. There's so much abundant life. And all that landscape is irrigated only with roof runoff and household recycled wastewater. That's it. Okay, so how did we succeed with this development? They had to control flooding. They had a requirement to do that. So, and typically what would be done is they would collect all the water in a big basin at the bottom of the site. So we said, hey, what about integrating that into the landscape? What if every plantable part of the landscape were a mini basin? And what if we add up the cumulative storage capacity of all those basins together? Well, we had a civil engineer do those calculations for us and found that the water holding capacity, the stormwater control capacity of this system, these mini basins, was 10 times that of the conventional system. Okay? So it performs way better. And it dramatically reduced the irrigation cost of the system. So now we're saving them money. Okay? First off, they've got this great promotional thing they can put out to market the whole place. And now they're getting a better performing, better looking landscape, and they have less flooding in the local area. So they were able to market themselves as the green co-housing development, it's a crazy oasis when you walk through that right now. Sorry, I don't have another photo to show you what it looks like today, but people can they can search Milagro co-housing and look it up. And they probably have some images on their website now. So it's the same approach that I took with the city. So when you're working with your client, well, what do they want? What's the bigger aim? What are they looking for? And so where can you find the spot where you can work with those living systems that are going to meet their desires, their needs, their requirements, but then go further? And that's what we did at Milagro Co-Housing. We have a dramatically superior flood control system. We have a much more verdant, beautiful landscape than they would have had before, and we've dramatically reduced their irrigation demand and needs. So the landscape's often the easy place to begin. Parking lots, they want parking lots. Well, we just want a standard parking lot. Well, okay, that's going to be a brutal experience. What if your parking lot, instead of being the thing you try and escape from, what if it's actually the lure? What if it's the bait that draws people in because it's such a freaking sexy, beautiful oasis parking orchard? So you just flip it. Yeah.
That's good.
Okay.
Question from Seeger. Seeger is a colleague of mine who's done work in Afghanistan. He's a hydrologist. He says, how often have you seen that the increase of groundwater levels has resulted in higher salinization of the soil? Or have you seen that at all?
So I have not seen that, but I certainly have read about that happening. But, well, actually, to be honest, where I've heard of that happening more is it's with more application of pumped groundwater, increasing the salinization, or canal water or river water, because that's continually introducing more salt. sometimes there can be a risk of a higher water table than is desired, but I haven't had that problem on any of my projects. Probably because I'm not concentrating on harvesting the water in the lowest point, the most saturated point. I'm concentrating harvesting water in the higher, drier places. And so I'm not contributing to waterlogging of a place that's most likely to be waterlogged. I'm instead moistening the spots the least likely to be moist. And a great colleague, Craig Sponholtz, he's got a website, watershedartisans.com. He's doing a lot of restoration work. He's aiming to make the wet spots wetter, but he's bringing back fish habitat and whatnot, working in creeks. Great stuff. But again, he's trying to enhance the flow of creeks. That's not a problem. That's not like where you'd have a field in a floodplain. He's not working on that kind of thing.
Yeah, cool. This is a question from North Carolina. It's not a dryland question, but let's give it a shot. This is from Michael Everhart. He says he's got 142 acres of mainly wetlands and wants to know about water harvesting within a wetland. He says, can he take water from the marsh areas for his agriculture? Could he distill it for drinking water? And would you still recommend rainwater harvesting in a wetland context?
Okay. That depends. So some great folks are the Bullock brothers in the northwest U.S., where some of the richest, most productive part of their land is wetlands. And when they moved onto that land, the wetlands had been drained decades before by the farmers that were no longer there, and they filled the drain hole that they had used to drain the wetlands. They plugged it up and brought the wetlands back. And now it's one of the most biodiverse areas in the San Juan Islands, thanks to their effort. But it depends on what you're trying to do. So readers of my books have been doing a lot of water harvesting in the New Orleans area because things have gotten so bad with contamination of the waters that they had to look to the rainwater as a clean source of water. That could be one instance. The other thing is droughts and dry seasons are relative. So I've done workshops in Georgia and Wisconsin, so where they get 50 inches of rain a year, 5 times what we get. It still makes sense because their droughts and dry seasons are hard on their plantings. So we use the same strategies. The only thing that changes is the plant palette. So we're using plants specific to their area. So if this person that asked the question is finding that they're having issues with certain plantings suffering from drought, first I would look and see, well, did they put those plants in there? You're like, did they put the wrong plant in the wrong spot? Okay, because sometimes it's that simple. But if they did a good job at that and it's still suffering, well, then it might make sense to be to do some water harvesting. So I don't know if that's answering it. Yeah, and I'll just bring this other thing up. In one of my blogs on my website, maybe you search in the blog for rain beer. In Atlanta, Georgia, there is a brewery that was collecting the rainwater off their roof to make rain beer. And they got CNN, they got incredible coverage on that. People were loving it, and man, it was delicious too. So they turned this flooding problem into a delicious beer.
That and some good marketing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say another thing. In both drylands and wetlands, typically, when you do water harvesting right, you are concentrating and infiltrating water in the right spots. And when we have flooding, we're typically doing the opposite in wet and dry climates.
Agreed.
Cool. Hey, Neil, I had an idea. We had Michael Jordan, the Bee Whisperer from the Survival Podcast. He's on. He had an idea. He had a video of the runoff of his property, so I could bring that up, and he could kind of describe what's going on, and maybe get input from Brad. Does that sound like something that?
If we've got the bandwidth for the video, I'd be fine with that.
Yeah, let's check it out. Like, I've got 15 minutes till I got a board, but this sounds like a fun experiment we could do. All right, Michael, I'm going to unmute you, and I'm going to pull up that video you sent so we can get that up there.
Right on. Brad, excellent information. Everything from land assessment to integration of doing it and then going to the city and saying, haha, that's the best part about everything I've seen that you've done on here is that you have to show by initiation and get it going. And Neil's brought up my question. It was one of them that was about the runoff that comes in on your land and what you do about getting all the food and stuff to absorb it. That's the rain running down my road. I made a diversion. I have to use the terminology right. That it's called a diversion lane.
It's gone, Raleigh. The picture is gone. You got to go back to it being small, I think. There we are.
Yeah, so what it is right there it shows the diversion, and I had the diversion, and right here is where it drops in, and this ditch is actually 4 foot deep. It's 1 inch wide, 4 foot deep, and I pile brewer's grain from a local brewery in it for saturation to start filtering out some of the toxins off the road. It goes completely around my yard like an S. So that's what you're seeing is basically it comes around and it goes underneath here into a 3-inch pipe. And there's the water. See, it just kind of loops around this whole raised bed area that I've got in the center. And then goes underneath my sidewalk. And then it goes into a 3-inch slotted pipe where then it kind of disperses in my yard. I think we put a measuring bass in it that's about 2,000 to 2,500 gallons of runoff on a slow day. Then I saturate in there. See, there it comes in. How I got away with all of it is I told the city that I don't want to spend the money paving the road, but it's a safety hazard because you guys are not diverting the road away from the people. I said, I will put in a diversion line, and I will divert the water onto my own property, and then I will use it from there where it will be a safe walkway from people down the road as well as my family coming out of my house. And the gentleman said, the rain runs off to different locations and stuff. It says, as long as you're not pushing it on somebody else's land and you are not, using major stock ponds and stuff on it. I said, not a problem. I don't plan on doing any of that. But what I did do is I did measure off from the exit line of that 3-inch pipe at the end of this run is I've dug what we call a wet well, a septic or a leach well, and what it does is now that fills up with water, and then I can use a little pump. I have a little solar pump, and then I can pump that water anywhere on my property, and I'm not collecting it. It's actually seeping into the ground, and now it is I forget what they're called. It's a type of well, but it's a seep well. It's just seeping water in from the ground. That is legal in my area as long as I'm not dwelling to pump. It's just natural saturation from the ground, but I'm making the natural saturation happen myself by the water runoff. And Brad, your systems are, you're cutting into the curves and stuff, man. That's awesome. I'm really loving that. I wish more people would look into that. It does. Bringing water into your property actually helps your city sewer plants because you're doing diversion from them for overcoming. That's how one reason I was able to pass mine is that I had the sewer guy come out And he says, he's actually kind of helping us because he's doing the diversion, and that gets us so we don't have water flooding our sewer systems and our grates downtown. So he says if actually more people divert the water back onto their properties a little bit more, we'd actually have better water flow, and we wouldn't have raccoons and stuff, because when the water's gone, it leaves pockets of crap in our sewers, and the rats and the raccoons have an opportunity. But so if you're composting and bringing that stuff in, like Brad said, you do tremendous amount of stuff, man. So Brad, man, super awesome, and Neil for bringing this on. I've enjoyed this program immensely.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it, man.
I do want to have you on one of these days to talk about your Yemeni beehives.
You like those round hives?
Oh yeah.
Dude, those are spectacular. But I'll let Brad keep talking. We'll talk about that sometime, Neil.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Michael.
Yes, I'd say great work, Michael, on that. And then a couple things to add is, one, this kind of also applies to the question of the person that was struggling to figure out how to get their client to buy into some of these strategies, is every site is going to be unique. Every site is going to have its own driver, its own needs, its own potential. And so, and it's also going to be different in every bioregion. So here in Tucson, the biggest driver is the perceived scarcity of water. But in Portland, Oregon, and Detroit and other areas that have a combined sewer overflow, where all the storm water goes into the same pipe as the sewage, and in big storms there's not enough room in the pipe, so human effluent comes up out of the storm drains and into people's basement drains. That's a big driver. So it sounds like Michael's got a similar thing there when saving the sewer. So that can be a driver. Sometimes it's flooding. So tap into what is happening in your area and see how you can address that specifically. And then the other thing I was just going to, two other things is, one, we initially got the curb cuts legal by saying, okay, well, let's just direct street runoff, which runoff from public street into public right-of-way. So we never pulled it was never made known that we were putting water anywhere other than the public right-of-way. Okay, so that avoided the confrontational discussion at the time of the question, is it legal to take public street runoff and put it onto private property because of Western water rights. So that's how we started. We just said, we'll just take the easy path. We'll keep public street runoff in public street right-of-way. And that was an easy thing. Well, it just happened, I think, last month that someone wanted to, a developer of new houses wanted to take street runoff, public street runoff, into private property. And he got it through. So now that's since been approved. But every community might have different ways on that. So, and remember, we don't have to get all the way right away. Let's at least get a start and a foothold, and move from there. Then the other thing I was just going to say is, it's good you've got some biofiltration going on early on, but I'd encourage you to do a lot more perennial plantings at your inlet point to get even more bioremediation going on. And just plain on the safe side, I like to be street runoff for orchards, roof runoff for annuals. You might be fine, but you also might be wise for you to connect with your local university or whatnot and see if you can get them to do some soil sampling. Could be a great grad student project or whatnot. Just so you're getting some data too, which can help you evolve your system and can help evolve policy.
Cool. Well, we are hitting the 90-minute mark. I would love to talk with you more about mesquite, but I think we're going to have to save it for another time. I've got about 1,000 Prosopis velutina growing in Saudi Arabia, and we're feeding them to camels at the moment because I can't figure out how to convince people to eat it. But that's for another conversation, another time. Anyhow, anybody else, if you've got a question, put it in. This is your last chance to ask Brad Lancaster anything you want on this webinar.
Now's the time, folks.
Yep.
And also, we got to respect the memory of Mark Moody, amazing mesquite farmer. We had him on the webinar just only a few weeks before he passed away. Incredible. So thanks for preserving the knowledge in his memory, Brad, and using all of the native knowledge of mesquite, because it's super important. It's amazing stuff.
Yeah, well, it was. I'm really glad you all did that webinar, and I actually got to visit him on his farm just before he passed as well, close to the date that you guys released that, or were doing the webinar. But yeah, he was a very generous person in sharing the information, wanting to see that continue. And I just wanted to add, too, another big shift we're pushing for here with a lot of these wild edibles is how can we create a non-extractive agricultural system in terms of water and fertility. So we're growing all these amazing foods just on rainfall and street runoff. There's no pumped water. There's no imported city water. There's no imported river water. Rather, we're doing so in a way that is actually, with the surplus, helping. Well, at minimum, what's going on is by not pumping the water in the first place, we're helping recharge, catch up, natural recharge, catch up with extraction. And then, when the right conditions are present, we're also helping recharge the aquifer directly. And Aaron Kaufman of Southwest, I think it's Southwest Hydrology, I'll send you all the link. He's been doing some great research on that in the Santa Fe area.
All right.
So, yeah.
We've got a few last-minute questions here. Raleigh, I think you're good to go if you need to go. You're boarding in like 5 minutes. But Brad and I can close this out if you need to take off at any time.
I will say just thank you so much, Brad. I really appreciate your time. Dang this thing, but I really like water is life, so I appreciate all of your work, and especially for the people in dry lands. You're teaching people how to take power and security back into their own hands. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for spreading the word.
All right, this question's from a development in Florida, Brad. Have you run into the issue of how to prevent fruit and nut drop from very tall and mature trees? There we go. The recording's off.
All right.
The recording's done. Typically, after the recording, I stick around. I handle anyone else's questions. If you want, you can stick around too. We had one question that I was going to answer about who was it? It was Louis or Louis. It looks like a French name. He said, "How do I figure out how much rainwater is coming in from adjacent properties?" Are you still here, Louis? Because I'll talk to that if you're still around. And here's my attendees. No, it looks like it. Yeah, Louis is here. So, Louis, when you're trying to measure how much runoff you've got coming onto your site, you've got to know the area of where that runoff is sourced from, essentially where you are in the watershed and what's above you in the watershed. And then you've got to know the intensity of the rainfall that you expect. How much water are you going to get per hour or per 20 minutes or per day? And then the other thing you need to know about is your runoff percentage. What percentage of the water that hits, given a certain intensity, is going to get absorbed versus run off? And if you've got those three numbers, then you can calculate with very, very confidently how much water you expect to run off, given the intensity of the rainfall over a certain period of time. And I typically use Google Earth to calculate that stuff, and a couple other things. Carrie is asking about she's got a 15% slope and wants to ask about making basins on a slope. And Carrie, for me on that, my first question is, what is your natural angle of repose? And are you in rocky terrain, or are you on grassy terrain, or is it stuff that's going to run off really quickly if you cut into it? There's way too many details that you need to know before anyone can make a really good recommendation about something like that. You have anything to add to that, Brad?
Well, I think you asked really good questions there, which just prompted one thing too, is that oftentimes, sorry, my phone's going off.
It's all right. We're not recording. This is the relaxed part.
Oh, okay. I've just got I'm supposed to be doing a phone meeting here, so I'll have to go off pretty soon.
Yeah,
but
that's fine.
I'd say on that is a lot of times people want to do an intervention when it's not necessary or even appropriate. And so your question of is it vegetated or not, I think it's a great one, because at least in dry climates, I've seen it and have been guilty in the past of wanting to create swales or other earthworks in what has been a very healthy, like grassland. And after doing the earthwork and making the scar, it was years before that was healed up, whereas had it just been left as the grass as it was, would have been a much better approach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just because you can do an intervention doesn't mean it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right. All right, if you've got a meeting you got to go to, you should take off.
All right. Well, thanks again for all this, and good seeing you virtually anyway.
That's right. That's right. We'll do it in person one of these days.
Yeah, I'd love it. That'd be great.
Cool. All right, take care, Brad.
Okay.
Bye, everybody. We're going to shut it down.